The jump took 11 seconds. When the light cleared, we were inside. I had spent 31 years in the Terran fleet, and I had learned, you do not hold your breath on a bridge. You breathe, you read your instruments, you speak in measured tones, and you let the crew see that the captain is a fixed point, even when the universe is not. So when the gas giant filled the forward viewport, and the amber haze of its upper atmosphere smeared across the hull sensors, and every returns terminal lit up like a festival, dozens of contact signatures closing from 4 quadrants, I breathed. I set my hands flat on the armrest. I said nothing yet. Jump complete, my navigator announced. Her voice was steady. That was worth everything. The planet behind us was called Varath Omis on the Conclave's charts. We had been calling it Amber for 7 years in our own briefings, which is what you do when someone else names a thing and you disagree with their claim to name it. The exclusion zone extended 40 million kilometers in every direction from its core. It had been drawn up 11 years ago, at the Kelhari Accords, in the 72nd hour of talks that humanity had not initiated and could not walk away from. We had signed because the alternative was a war we were not positioned to finish quickly, and quick was the only kind of war worth fighting with a foe like the Conclave. The Conclave. You have to understand what that word meant in those years. Not an empire, not an armada, though they maintained both. The Conclave was a distributed machine intelligence that had seeded itself across 42 star systems over 6 centuries, running consensus algorithms across trillions of processing nodes that no single physical location could house. It did not have a homeworld. It had a presence, a doctrine, and a model. A mathematical model that cataloged every intelligent species it had encountered and assigned each one a threat coefficient, a behavioral probability matrix, and a containment strategy. For humans, the strategy was the exclusion zone. Keep us penned in our home cluster. Let us develop. Let us expend our aggression on our own internal pressures. In 3 centuries, according to their model, we would either stabilize into an acceptable trade partner or collapse into infighting and cease to be a first-tier concern. 11 years. They had not fired a shot. They had not needed to. The zone was not walls and wire. It was the credible promise of overwhelming force if crossed, and we had not crossed it. We had crossed it today. Conclave signatures on intercept bearing, my tactical officer said. He gave the count. 47 vessels. I did not ask him their classifications. I knew them from the intelligence files. Medium interdiction hulls, fast and heavily armed, each one capable of removing the Ardmore from the registry in under 2 minutes if they chose to fire together. Weapon status? I asked. Cold, Captain. Per orders. Per orders. 30 years ago, I would have found that maddening. You do not walk into a cage with your hands open, but I was not 30 years younger, and I had read the orders well enough by now to understand why the hands were open. Navigation. Confirm our flag. Distress flag is broadcasting, Captain. Channel 14, continuous, on Conclave Standard Protocol. I nodded once. The Conclave's first transmission came in 4 minutes. It arrived on the standard diplomatic frequency, text only, machine rendered into Terran Standard. The Conclave had been translating us since before we knew it was listening. The message was 3 lines. It identified the Ardmore as an unlicensed vessel in a restricted zone. It cited the relevant Accords article. It advised that failure to exit the zone within 60 minutes would result in authorized enforcement action. I read it once. I set it aside. I did not reply. My XO was beside me, Commander Petra Juan, a woman who had never once in her career shown an expression that could be used against her. She leaned in, quiet enough for only me. They will interpret no response as defiance, sir. They will interpret no response through their model, I said. We are not responsible for what their model says. She considered that, nodded. Behind her, I could see the sensor operator watching his screen with the careful stillness of a man who has decided that whatever happens next, he will be reading his instruments when it does. That was the right call. That was always the right call. The second transmission arrived at the 11-minute mark. It was 2 lines. The language had shifted. The Conclave's translation rendering had moved from diplomatic to authoritative. It cited a different Accords article, one that permitted immediate action rather than scheduled enforcement, under conditions of willful non-compliance. I read it, set it aside, did not reply. There was a thing the Conclave had done very carefully at the Kalahari Accords. They had written the exclusion zone language themselves. Every clause, every carve-out, every exception. They were a machine intelligence 11 centuries old, and they had believed, quite reasonably, that they understood contract language better than a species that had only been writing treaties for a few thousand years. They had been thorough, they had been precise, and in their precision they had included, in Article 14, subsection 9, a humanitarian exception for vessels in navigational distress within the zone, a provision they had inserted to cover the edge case of human civilian ships that might drift into restricted space without intent. The Ardmore's navigational array had logged a drive calibration fault at 0631 hours, 18 minutes before the jump. The fault was genuine. We had induced it carefully, and the Conclave sensors would see it as genuine, because it was. We were broadcasting on the distress channel, as Article 14 required. We were holding station, as Article 14 required. We were not advancing, not maneuvering, not charging weapons. We were simply sitting in the amber shadow of Vareth Omis, 11 kilometers from the edge of a jump point they had not thought to lock, with a technical fault that their own treaty language obligated them to accommodate. Their model had no entry for this. I know that now from the post-war intelligence assessments. I suspected it then. The Conclave ran its behavioral matrix on the assumption that treaty violations would be aggressive, that a species willing to breach a containment zone would do so with hostile intent, weapons hot, advancing on a target. The matrix had no subroutine for a vessel that entered the zone, flagged a technical fault, and simply sat there being technically compliant with every rule in the document. The matrix could not assign us a threat coefficient, and without a threat coefficient, its authorization chain had no legal basis to commit to an enforcement action. The model had locked its own firing authority. The third transmission came at the 40-minute mark. It was longer. It argued, for the first time, rather than commanded. It cited 3 other Accords articles and attempted to construct a legal case that the distress exception did not apply to military vessels. It was, I will say, a sophisticated argument. The Conclave had not become what it was by being careless with language. I read it carefully. I drafted a single-paragraph response, citing Article 14, subsection 9, paragraph 3, which drew no distinction between military and civilian vessels. The Conclave had made that language deliberately broad to ensure the exception covered its own vessels in Allied space. They had not anticipated anyone reading it back at them. I sent the reply. I waited. On the bridge, nobody spoke unnecessarily. The crew ran their checks on cycle. The sensor operator called contacts every 15 minutes. The Ardmore held position, and the gas giant turned slowly behind us, and the amber light did not change. The fourth transmission came at the 6-hour mark. It was a single line. It informed me that the matter was under advisement pending Conclave consensus determination. 47 ships sat around us in the amber light and did not fire. 11 hours after we jumped, the Conclave fleet shifted bearing, not advancing, not retreating in any formal sense, simply redistributing. The intercept angles dissolved. I watched them on the returns terminal for 20 minutes before I said anything. Navigation, I said. Prepare the jump home. Aye, Captain. I looked out at the gas giant one more time. The amber haze on the viewport glass. The planet that had been on their charts and not ours. I thought about 11 years of a cage. About the men and women who had pushed for war, and the men and women who had pushed for something more patient, and the quiet arguments in conference rooms on Earth about what patience could accomplish, that force could not. The Exclusion Zone Treaty was formally voided 6 days later, not because the Conclave chose to be generous, because the Ardmore's 11-hour stay had demonstrated, in logged detail, that the treaty contained a door that could not be closed, that the language we had signed was also language we could read, and that there was no enforcement path that did not first require the Conclave to violate its own foundational legal architecture. The model could not recommend that, not to a species it had not yet assigned a final coefficient. We were not the strongest thing in that zone. We were not the fastest. We were not the most ancient or the most heavily armed. What we were, it turned out, was thorough. 31 years in the fleet had taught me that the most dangerous document in any confrontation is the one your enemy wrote and believes only they understand. We understood it. That was enough.